Hello, my fellow gnomes. Now, in the last episode, we got this raycasting going on, and we were clicking and making things red, which was cool and everything, but it wasn't really very useful. So in this episode, we're going to start using what we learned to make our tower placement system. Now, I want to be able to place a tower when they press a button. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Starter GUI. We're going to create a screen GUI. We'll just name this game GUI for now. And we're going to add in a button. We're going to probably have to improve all of our GUI and generally make the game look prettier a bit later on. But for now, we'll just add in a very basic text button. We're going to put this at the bottom of the screen, I think. We'll get it positioned nice and neatly. There we go. And for the text of it, we're probably just going to give it the name of the thing we want to spawn in. And I've got a basic tower I've just created, and it's called the Slinger, okay? So I'm going to paste that in now, right? I've got this guy over here. I'll just pop him into the workspace. There we go. This is our Slinger. He's got a little slingshot, but he's like a little sort of gnome character, or sort of like a scout, I suppose you might think of him. And we're going to pop him not inside server storage, because we need to have access to him on the client because we're in a local script. So we're going to go to replicated storage, which is replicated on both the server and the client. If you're not too sure about the whole distinction between server and client side and local and server scripts, I've got some videos on that you might want to check out. But we're going to go ahead and add in a folder, and this is going to be our towers folder. And we'll drag our Slinger into our towers folder. And then when they press this button at the bottom, the idea is we will spawn in the Slinger to where they want it. So first of all, let's go into our game controller script. And actually, let's move it. Let's move it from being in the starter player scripts into the game GUI. And then we'll need a variable for the GUI. So just on line 4, we can add a new line. Local GUI will just equal the script.parent. And then we can get when they click that button. So how about we head on, we'll head on down just before this input service one. We can say GUI dot, and later on we'll have more buttons, but for now we're going to name this button just spawn to keep things easy. We're just going to be spawning in the one tower today. So GUI.spawn dot, and we use the activated event. Now this will actually work for both mobile and PC, but obviously we're just focusing on the PC controls today. And we connect that to a function, and then we can go a little event. So we can just test it works. We'll print clicked, something like that. So now if I'm playing, hopefully we should see it says clicked down in the output. Let's see. If we click this, there we go. We can see click is appearing down there. So we don't know that that works. That's good. Then the next thing we want to do is we want to spawn in that Slinger tower. So then I'm going to go and create a new function just above this. And we'll call it local function add placeholder tower. And then we will start a little bit like in our mob spawner script. If you might remember, we open up our mob script. Where's it gone? There it is. You might remember how we checked that it existed first of all. Well, we're going to do a very similar thing here. So we're going to say local tower exists, and then we're going to need to search through, instead of server storage, we're going to need to search through replicated storage. So let's go ahead and grab the service for that. So right at the top of our script, with our other services, local replicated storage equals game get service replicated storage. And now once we've got that, we can say, let's get another variable for our tower as well. So local towers equal, typo there, let's make sure we spell it correctly, replicated storage And it's a good idea when we're in the client to wait for child. So we don't know exactly when everything will load in. So we'll have in a little wait. We'll wait for the towers to load in. And now that we've got this variable for it, in our add placeholder tower function, we can search through towers. And then we'll do a find first child and whatever, change that to a lowercase I, whatever name of the tower they want to search for. Again, like we did for our mobs. Now we're going to have to send that information. So in our spawn.activated, when they click that button, we then want to run this function. So run the function, and the parameter we're going to provide, well, we're going to do it for the, well, let's just hard code it for now. So we'll type in quotation marks slinger, which is the name, the exact name of our model inside the towers folder. So once we've checked that it exists, so if tower exists, then we're going to want to clone it. So we can do that straight away. We could say local tower to spawn equals, and we'll use that variable, tower exists. So the existing one, and then we want to create a new copy of it. So we'll clone it, and then the tower to spawn, we set the parent of that. Because when you first clone something, it just kind of exists in the void, right? You create a copy, but you haven't actually placed it anywhere. So then we want to place it straight into the workspace. And in fact, what you might want to do is you might want to create a towers folder. So like we've got a mobs folder in the workspace, we'll have a towers folder in there as well. So we can say workspace.towers. And now we've done that, how about we just go and test everything's working so far? So we'll hit play. We'll see that there's no slinger in the game world at the moment. They're tucked away in replicated storage. But when we click this button, there we go. See, our slinger has suddenly spawned into the world. Super. We've still got this this red thing going on as well. We should probably get rid of that. We've got our first tower. And if I sort of push him out of the way a bit, that's it. Move out of the way, mate. And we click it again, we will have another one spawn in. Now, obviously, I don't want them just spawning into that predefined position. I want to be able to place them where I want. So let's head about and see if we can do that. So we'll hit stop. And let's get rid of that, that red colouring. So we'll just remove this lines 41 to 43. We'll get rid of that. And now let's see if we can place it. So we need to have access to this tower object that we've just created, that we've newly cloned inside this add placeholder tower function. We need access to this object inside of our run service loop, this function that's running every single frame. So when we get the mouse position, we want to be able to move around that object based on our mouse position. So instead of having this variable local just to this function, we're going to instead declare it right at the top. So we'll remove the local here, and then right at the top of our script, we will say, instead of it being item, we'll rename item now to tower to spawn. And initially, yep, that's just going to be nil. But then later on, we will be assigning it the value inside of the add placeholder tower function. And then inside of our loop, we can then actually start to use that. So we could start to give it a position. So now we'll get rid of this line here. And a position, of course, it has an X, Y, and a Z value. So the X value is easy enough. That's going to equal the result dot the position. Remember, this is the result of our raycast that we do. So whatever the array hits the ground, that's the position. So we can get the position.x, and then the y is going to be the same, result.position.y, and finally the z, result.position.z. Now we are going to want to change that y in a minute, but we'll just do it like this for now. And so then finally, our C frame position will be equal to a new C frame dot new comprising of those X, Y, and Z values. Oh, Z values, there we go. And then all we need to do in order to set position is we say tower to spawn, and we call the function set primary part C frame, and inside the brackets we just give it that C frame we've created. Now if your model doesn't have a primary part, it's very easy to do. Remember, just move it into workspace and you'll see I currently have the humanoid root part set as the primary part we see over here. But if I wanted to change it, all you need to do is click there and you get this special cursor, and I could set it to the right foot, for example, if we wanted. And then you see it gets this grey outline. But generally, if you've got a character model, you want it to be your humanoid root part as the primary part. Anyway, we'll tuck this guy back into the towers folder and then hit play again. And so now when we've got an error here. Attempt to index nil with set primary part. Right, so if we head back and we'll see we're assuming that we have got a tower to spawn, but we might not do, of course, because we're only going to have one if we've clicked that button. Otherwise, it's going to equal nil. So what we need to do inside of our render step is we don't need to be doing the raycast all the time. So we'll only bother raycast if we have a tower to spawn. So if tower to spawn is not nil, if it's got some kind of value, then we'll do all our raycasting. So now when we hit play, we won't have that problem. And if we hit spawn, we're going to have this, but it's going to keep flying towards us like this, which is really not what we want. Because what's happening is it's creating a ray to the ground and initially placing it down there. But then that ray is going to hit the character that we've just placed down. And so it's creating this kind of crazy recursive loop where it keeps hitting itself. And so the distance gets shorter and shorter. And then we have this effect where it flies towards us. So in order to fix this, what we need to do is we need to have the ray ignore the part or the model, that we're creating. So we'll hit stop. And inside of our raycast function, our mouse raycast, well, there's actually something we can use called raycast parameters. So let's get rid of these commented lines. We don't really need these anymore. And we'll create some new raycast parameters. So local raycast params equals raycast params dot new. Notice this one has an uppercase R, so it's a keyword highlighted in blue. This is just lowercase, so it's just a variable name. And then we're going to have a blacklist, or what's called a blacklist of things to ignore. So raycast params, using that variable again, dot filter type equals enum dot, I think it's raycast filter type, there we go, dot blacklist. So we can use something called a whitelist, which means it would only focus on certain parts, but we want it to see everything and just ignore our character that we're trying to spawn in, our tower. And so then we need to give it a table of things to ignore. So raycast params dot filter descendants instances, and we're going to set that equal to a table like this, which is going to contain multiple values with commas in between them. But we're going to use just a variable for this, so a blacklist variable, and this is going to be expected as a parameter of this function. So then when we call the mouse raycast function, which is down here, we're going to want to then filter that in. So we're going to want to send the tower to spawn, that model. If it exists, then we're going to want to send it in as something to ignore. Now remember, seeing as it's expecting a tower, we can't just send this on its own. We need to send it inside of a table. So we use these two squiggly brackets like that and put it inside of it. If we want, a bit later on, we could add some other things, right? We could add some parts of the map or something if we wanted to ignore them. But for now, we're just going to send the one tower to ignore. And now that we're sending this blacklist to it, this table, there's one more thing we need to change, which is when we create this raycast, we send the origin and the direction, and we also need to include those raycast parameters that we just made. So we add a comma and then add these. So now when we hit play, we hopefully shouldn't have anything flying towards us. We'll spawn in, and there we go. We can now move this around the world, and it's not going to have any annoying flying towards us. Now, we will notice that he's sort of partially submerged in the ground, which obviously isn't what we want. We want him to be standing upright. And we can also do this crazy thing where we can kind of move him underneath us, and he's going to start colliding with us, and we can get some probably crazy physics happening. There we go. We can sort of push ourselves along. There we go. Whoa! Which obviously is not desired behavior. So first of all, let's see if we can get him to stand upright. Now, the reason that this is happening currently is because we're just setting him to the position of wherever our mouse is. So our mouse is directly hitting the ground, and so he's going directly to the center of the ground that we're hitting. So we're going to need to add an offset. So to do that, we're going to go into our render stepped function where we set this x, y, and z. We can leave the x and z as it is, but we're going to change the y. So it's going to equal the position, which is fine, but then we're going to need to add on this offset. So the offset is going to be the tower to spawn, and we're going to get its humanoid, and then we're going to get the hip height property. So the hip height is the distance of the humanoid root part from the ground. So if you're using a standard sort of rig like I am, I think it is 2 studs. So let's see, the hip height is 2 studs in this one. So it's going to just add on 2. And then we need to add on, and then we also need to take into account the height of the humanoid root part itself. So to do that, we'll wrap this in brackets and we'll say tower to spawn dot primary part dot size dot y. So this is the height of the root part, and we'll divide it by 2. So we only want half of the height. So now I'll just zoom out so you can see all of that. Now when we hit play, he should hopefully be standing upright. Let's see, we'll spawn him in. Oh, we spelt that wrong. We put height. There we go. You got to watch out for your typos. So hip height. There we go. And now we will see he will spawn in, and he's perfectly standing upright, and he's almost standing over us. Now he's taller than us. It's quite foreboding. Now the next problem we've got is we don't want him to be able to push us all over the place, right? Although it's kind of cool to be able to jump on this sort of character, we don't want any collisions. So what we'll do is we'll add in a new collision group now. Head to model, collision groups, add a new one in called tower, and we'll do a very similar thing to before. We'll disable collisions with mobs, and let's just disable collisions with everything, okay? So it can only collide with the default game world, but none of these other groups. And then back into our game controller script. And when we first spawn it in, we're going to then have to loop through all of the parts. Again, this is like we did in our mob script, if you remember. We loop through all the parts. In fact, we can just copy this. We'll select this from the mob script, lines 29 to 33, copy it, and we're just going to paste it in here. Obviously, we need to change the new mob variable to the tower to spawn variable. And we're also going to need the physics service because we haven't got it in this local script. So at the very top, we can say local physics service equals game get service physics service. So there we go. We've got that. And now we've got no underlines. And we don't want to set it to the mob group, but the tower group. And then also, while we're looping through the parts, how about we give it a bit of a cool kind of effect? So we'll say object.material, and we're going to set the material type to enum.material.force field. So give it a sort of weird translucent effect, seeing as it's just going to be a placeholder template rather than the actual part. So let's see how that's looking. If we hit play now. Spawning the slinger, and ooh, there we go. That looks pretty cool, doesn't it? So you've got this sort of vague, ghosty outline, And if we move it towards the player, well, it's going to mess up the camera, but it's not going to push us around. And if we were to hover this in front of the mobs, it's not going to get in their way either. They can keep going and no problems there. Now, next thing we want to be able to do is we want to actually be able to click and place this guy down. Because at the moment, it's just always stuck to my mouse, and there's nothing I can do to get rid of it. And if I click this button again, I think it's going to start to break things, because then it's going to add in another template, and then I'm going to start to have all these template dudes everywhere. Look at that. But then none of them are spawned in properly. Although it looks pretty cool, it's certainly not very useful for my game. So let's hit stop. And first of all, let's look in our input began over here. So this is when they click, and this is what we're going to use now. So before we even checking if they're clicking, we're going to check if we actually have a tower to spawn. And if we do, then we'll check if they've clicked. And if they've clicked, then we're going to want to actually spawn it into the game world. Because at the moment, remember, this is a local script, it's just on the client. And so when I was placing all of those towers down, let me just do it again quickly. If I place all of these, and here they are on the client, but if I switch over to the server, well, they're not actually there, they're just local copies. So we need to make them on the server as well. And to do that, we're going to use a remote event. So head into replicated storage, create a new folder. We'll call this events. And inside of it, we'll add an event, and we will name that spawn tower. So then we can use this remote event to communicate with the server and to actually spawn one for real, to actually place it into the workspace for all the players, rather than it just being a local copy. So in order to get all of these, we're going to need some more variables. Head up to the top of our script, and let's create a variable for the events. So that will be replicated storage, wait for child, events, and then we're going to need one for the spawn tower event. So local spawn tower event, and that equals events. And again, we're going to wait for child because we don't know when everything is going to load in. Spawn tower. And I've got an extra T, get rid of that. And now we've got our spawn tower event. We can head down to our input began, and we can actually type that. And then all we need to say is, in order to send a message to the server using this, we just put colon to call a function fire server. And I think the information we want to send to the server is the name of the tower. So tower to spawn dot name. And then we want the position that we're currently at. So tower to spawn dot primary part dot cframe. So now we're sending these two bits of information off to the server. Well, we're going to need to create a server script to receive this information. So we're going to go, and we've got our mob script already, and we're going to need another module script for the towers. So this is going to look a little bit similar. And I think what we might actually do is we might just duplicate this. So we'll create a new copy of this, and we'll name one of them tower. And obviously we'll need to change it a little bit. So it should say tower at the top. We obviously don't need a move function. We'll have an attack function later on. But for now, we definitely want this tower.spawn function. So we want the name. We don't want a quantity or map, but we were sending its position, weren't we? So it'll be the cframe. So these are the two bits of information that we're going to send to this function. Now the thing with remote events is there's also another parameter, which is the name or the player who sends it. This is sent by default. It's kind of like a hidden parameter. So that'll be the first one, and then followed by the two that we are sending. And so we want to check actually if the tower exists. So we need to get the replicated storage again, copy that, and reference it in our in our tower. Oh no, I'm editing the wrong one, aren't I? Okay, let's change that. There we go. Now this one is called tower. and we'll rename the other one mob. There we go. Right, so we keep all our changes that we want in our mob script, and we'll update the tower script. And so now in here, we're going to check if the tower exists. And I know we've already done this on the client, but it's a good idea to also check on the server as well. So we want to look through that towers folder inside replicated storage, confirm that the name that they're requesting actually exists, because we don't want to, remember, a client can just send any event at any time. So you don't want them sort of hacking into your game and just trying to spawn things that they actually don't exist or they're not allowed to. So if that tower exists, then we're going to want to spawn it in. We don't need to do any of this quantity stuff anymore. So let's remove this. Let's remove all of this. There we go. Control X. And we'll move this loop. Delete that. And then we'll paste it back in. There we go. We don't need the wait either. So instead of new mob, we'll change our variable to be new tower, so it makes a bit more sense. We'll change all of these. And then, of course, instead of mob exists, it's tower exists. And the C-frame, it's not map.start.cframe anymore. It's that C-frame position we've been provided. So we'll copy that, paste it in here. And then the next thing we want to do is place it not in the mobs folder, but the towers folder into workspace. That one we just created earlier. The network ownership, yep, we'll set it to the server. And this before, this was setting it to the mob collision group. Now I know we have already set the collision group on the client in the local script, but that only takes effect on the client. So we need it to take effect on the server as well. So I know this is a little bit annoying, but it's not too much bother. So we'll loop through everything and we'll set it onto the tower collision group on the server as well. So it's authoritative. We'll just change that to requested. Tower does not exist. If it doesn't, if that's not true. And then finally, we need to change where it says mob down here to tower. So once we've done all of that, our tower module script is complete. All we need to do now is connect it to that remote event we created. So we're going to need a variable for the events. So we can just copy that from the local script we had, right? We can go down here, paste that in, and then we're going to need the spawn tower event variable. We will paste that in as well. And so now we've got both of them, we can say just below this function, we'll say spawn tower event dot, and we use the event on server event. And whenever that happens, whenever the server is contacted, we want to connect it into the function, which of course is tower.spawn. So now everything should be all connected together. So hopefully now, when we hit play and we press that button and we get our little guy, when we now click with our left mouse button, it should send that remote event to the server. Let's try it. We'll click. And nothing happens. Okay, that's good, isn't it? That's fantastic. Okay, let's head back. And the one thing we got after we created this tower module script is we didn't actually require it from anywhere. So remember, we need to go into our main script. And just like we've required script.mob, well, we also need to require the tower script. So local tower equals require script.tower. So that's going to call it into action, because the module script can't run it on its own. It needs to be required. So now if we get going, we're in the game, we click there, and then we click with our left mouse button. There we go, we've spawned one in. Fantastic. And we can click and we can spawn a few more of them in. And there we go, we can start to fill up the world. Now, obviously, we don't want to be forever placing them. I've still got this placeholder, which is a bit annoying. Ideally, we want to remove the placeholder after we place the first one, and then give them the option to click again if they want. And we can also see the collision groups are working because the mobs are running through them. And if I was to switch over to the server, we can see they have definitely been added. So let's stop these placeholder from appearing all over the place. Head into our local script, and we're going to create a new function just above the add placeholder tower function. We're going to create one called remove. So local function remove placeholder tower. And this doesn't need any parameters. And all we'll do in here, we'll say if there is a tower to spawn, then tower to spawn, we will destroy it. And we will set the value of the variable to nil. And once we've done that, we just need to call this function. So we might as well call this function every time we add a new one, because we don't want to create too many copies. So we will remove it here. And also, do we want to remove it? I think we're going to want to remove it after we've fired that event, after we have placed one. So after we've placed one, here it is down here, we will remove it as well. So it should never end up with two copies. Let's just check if that's working for us. So I go and I click to spawn one in. I click and it spawns in and we've got no placeholder. Fantastic. And if I try and spam the button or anything, it's not going to spam in multiple copies. It's just going to give us the one placeholder. Fantastic. So there's one more thing I would like to do. I know this has been a long video, but bear with me. And that is, I would like to be able to limit where I can place these. Now, we're not going to make this too complicated just yet, but I don't really want to be able to place them onto the middle of the road like I've done just there. And I would maybe like to be able to rotate them as well, possibly. That would be nice. So in order to limit where I can place it, we're going to need to check what we are touching again with our mouse. So if we go into our render stepped function and we can check what the result is actually hitting. So what we're going to say is if we're getting the result and we're getting an instance, then we'll check if that result.instance, and we're going to check its parent, because what we're going to do is we're going to create a folder. If its parent.name equals tower area, we're going to call it, then we do want to be able to spawn something in. So inside of our map, at the moment it's very, very basic. We've only got this single piece of grass and some trees. But I'm just going to create a new folder inside of my map. And I'm going to call it, what shall we call it? We'll call it the tower area, because that's what we've called it in our local script, tower area. It's got to be exactly the same. So now that we've called it that, we're going to move our grass into that. Again, we've only got the one piece of grass. Let's just clone this, shall we? And we'll just create a sort of weird bit of piece of floating grass in the air. So there can be some sort of aerial point. So there we go. We've got two places now we can place objects, either here or up here, but we can't place them on the road, at least in theory. So then in our script, in order to control this, we're going to need to have a variable, and we'll call this canPlace. And we actually want this to be a global variable. So right at the top of our script, after our tower to spawn function, we'll create another variable and we'll call this one canPlace. So initially, I don't know, we'll set this to false initially, so they won't be able to place. And then inside of this render step function, where we're checking what they're hitting. So if it's tower area, then we will set the canPlace equal to true. Now, if it's not, if they're touching anything else in the world with their raycast, then we don't want them to be able to place a unit. So we set this to false. And just to give the player a little bit of feedback on whether they are able to place a tower or not, how about we sort of color the tower? So we'll create a new function just over here, and we'll say local function color place. Oh, I added a space there. Color placeholder tower. And the only parameter this is going to take is the color. So we put the color in there. And then all we're going to do is loop through the tower, just like we did here when we added the placeholder tower. So we can actually just copy this, copy all of that, paste this in here. And instead of setting the material or anything like that, we'll just set the color. So object.color, and this will be equal to whatever color is provided as the parameter. So paste that there. And then when we call this function, all we need to do is specify what color we want. So down here, after we've confirmed whether they can or cannot place something, we will say color placeholder tower, and we'll give a color. And that will be color3.new. We'll set everything to green. So 0, 1, 0. And then if they can't place something, then we're going to set it to red. So that will be 1, 0, 0. So now that we've got this global canPlace variable, we can use this to check. Before we fire the server, let's just check if we actually have permission to place something. So inside of here, we can say if canPlace, then and only then will we actually try and send requests to the server. So now let's do the fun bit and check if that's working for us. And then we'll spawn in a slinger. And there we go, he's bright green because he's on the grass. And if we move him onto the path here, he's going to turn bright red. And if we click, we're not going to be able to place him at all because we're not allowed to, of course. Onto the green, if we click, we can place him. And we'll add another one in on the same thing. So we can't place him on the trees or anything. But if we move him up here, we can place him up high as well. There we go, we can place him up there. Fantastic. We really need to improve this map at some point, don't we? So I know this video is running on a bit, but if there's one more thing that we might want to be able to do, and this is rotate the units. Now, thankfully, this is pretty easy. So we'll hit stop, and we're going to create one more global variable at the top of our script. And we're going to call this rotation. So local rotation. And initially, this is just going to be set to 0. But in our input began function down here, after we've checked if it's mouse button 1, we're going to have an alternative condition. Else if the... Oh, wrong one. Want it here, don't we? Else if the input dot keycode equals enum dot keycode dot r. So if they press R for rotate, then we're going to get the rotation and we're going to say plus equals. The rotation equals the current rotation value plus 90. And then inside of our render step function, where we're setting the C frame, we don't want any of the X, Y, or Z values to change, but we're going to take this cframe.new and we're actually going to multiply it by cframe.angles, and it's going to be 0 on the X axis, but then on the Y axis, we're going to want to use that rotation value. Now we can't just type rotation on its own, we need to convert it into radians. So we're going to say math.radians, and this is basically degrees then. So then we put rotation, and then finally we put 0 because we don't want to rotate it on any other axes. So then it's going to take this C frame and add it to the tower's C frame. And finally, let's just reset the rotation in our remove placeholder. So after we've removed it all, we will set the rotation back to the default of 0. So now we'll hit play, and hopefully we should now be able to rotate. So let's see, we'll click the spawn one in, and we'll press R, and there we go, we can spin him around. So we can have one facing that way, and then we'll have one facing with his back to him. And we spawn the next one in, there we go. So we've got them all facing each other, pretty cool. And we can have a whole army now of slingers. Obviously, none of these guys can actually attack at the minute, and that's going to be something we have to work on in our tower module script. Because we've got this, if we remember, we've got this tower testing script, but we're going to need to combine the contents of this into our module script. And we're going to need to get some animations working for our guys and all sorts. But that is certainly enough for this one video. Hopefully, you've all been able to follow along. I know it's been a bit of a long one, but thank you very much for watching. And if you found this helpful, then please leave a like, and why not even consider subscribing. And I will see you all in the next episode. Goodbye.